In modern warfare, I think the assumption is always that the side that wins is the one with, well, the most missiles.
Right. Or maybe the loudest, most omnipresent propaganda machine.
Yeah, exactly. We expect the victor to just flood the zone with their narrative.
But what if the ultimate weapon in a massive global conflict isn't noise at all?
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, what if the most terrifying, paralyzing tactic a state actor can deploy is just absolute weaponized silence?
Weaponized silence. Wow.
Yeah. It completely upends our understanding of how power is projected.
Oh.
We're so conditioned to analyze what people are saying that we kind of forget to calculate the devastating strategic impact of a deliberate void.
Right, avoid. Like when they just give you nothing.
Exactly. When an adversary simply refuses to give you any data points, they aren't losing the narrative.
They're forcing you to construct your own nightmare.
That is exactly it.
And that psychological nightmare is exactly what we are plunging into today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one. It's intense.
It really is. I mean, if you're listening to this, you're probably constantly bombarded with alerts, hot takes, counter takes, algorithmic echo chambers. It's an exhausting way to live.
Totally exhausting.
You just want to cut through the noise and actually understand the mechanics of what is happening in the world. So today we're embarking on a highly focused, really intense mission.
We are taking a single, incredibly dense artifact from the modern internet, and we are going to dissect the underlying architecture of its arguments.
Right. So what's the artifact?
It's a fascinating historical snapshot. It's a blog post published on Saturday, March 2026.
2026. Keep that date firmly in mind. The post is titled Barackface, the Iran War, and the Information Warfare.
Yeah, and the author is a man named Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
And what makes this source so compelling to analyze isn't just the text of the essay itself, right?
No, not at all. I mean, the text is a very sharp structural critique of how the 2026 Iran war is being fought and perceived, but it's really the entire ecosystem of the webpage that's wild.
Yeah, the ecosystem is dizzying. The author claims, right at the top, to have been Barack Obama's first full-time volunteer in New York City.
Right. But then surrounding this essay on war and propaganda is this huge array of embedded YouTube videos and sidebars linking to literally decades of his own writings.
Decades of writings on, like, artificial intelligence, global economics, and
A spiritual economic philosophy he calls calciism.
calciism. Yeah, we'll definitely get into that. It's not just a standard political op-ed. It's a digital mosaic.
It really is a real-time snapshot of a mind trying to process a global conflict by synthesizing dozens of wildly different data streams.
So our objective here is to deconstruct his core thesis, which is that information warfare is creating deliberate, manufactured confusion during this 2026 conflict.
Yes. We're going to examine his claims about media culpability, how we even define military victory in the 21st century.
Which is super complicated.
Very complicated. And the crucial geopolitical role he assigns to the Iranian people. And finally, we'll analyze the broader digital and philosophical ecosystem presented on this single web page.
But before we get into all that, we need to lay down an important marker for you listening.
Yeah, a very important disclaimer.
This source material operates in a highly charged political atmosphere.
Extremely charged. The embedded videos and the author's commentary touch on deeply polarizing figures and narratives.
Spanning from right-wing statements made by Donald Trump on Fox News to left-wing geopolitical analysis from the electronic intifada.
Alongside intense religious commentary, too.
Right. So our goal today is strictly analytical. We are not taking sides.
Absolutely not. We are not endorsing any of these viewpoints or validating their claims.
We're impartially unpacking the ideas, the tactics, and the information landscape exactly as they are presented in the text.
Purely to understand how they function within the author's broader argument about global confusion.
Okay, let's unpack this. The author kicks things off not with a breakdown of troop movements or drone strikes, but with that concept of weaponized confusion.
Yes, and he points a very direct finger at his first major structural culprit in this information war.
The media.
The media. Specifically, he singles out the U.S. media and the Indian media.
And he strips their behavior down to just basic economic incentives, right?
Yeah, he argues that their fundamental business model relies on the continuous generation of drama.
Drama.
The exact quote from the text is, they have to make it sound like one day this side is winning, the next day the other side is winning, so people keep coming back.
You know, it's like broadcasting a sports match where the announcers have to pretend the score is tied in the final seconds every single day just to stop you from changing the channel.
That's a great analogy.
Even if one team is actually up by 40 points, the announcers will hyper-focus on, like, a single missed pass or a minor injury.
Right, to convince the audience that a massive game-changing comeback is imminent. And that analogy gets right to the heart of the mechanism. The financial structure of modern media requires perpetual tension.
Perpetual tension.
Yes. And if we connect this to the bigger picture for you, the listener, it explains that profound feeling of whiplash you experience when you check your newsfeed.
Oh, whiplash is so real.
Right. If the media's structural mandate is continuous engagement, then clarity is actually their enemy.
Wow. Clarity is the enemy.
Yeah, resolution is a financial disaster for them. They need the pendulum to swing perpetually.
So the author is suggesting that our fundamental understanding of global conflicts is being continuously distorted.
Yes, but not necessarily by some grand, malicious ideological conspiracy.
Just by the basic commercial necessity of engineering a daily cliffhanger,
Exactly.
which introduces a massive problem for state actors trying to operate in that environment.
A huge problem.
The author compares the competing forms of state propaganda trying to navigate this media landscape, specifically contrasting the Pentagon with the Iranian regime.
Right. Now, he outright acknowledges that the Pentagon is a primary source of propaganda. He's not naive.
He knows they are spinning narratives.
But he actually gives the Pentagon a bizarre sort of compliment.
Yeah, he says, at least the intent and the strategy become clear.
He prefers the transparency of their bias.
Because he understands the Pentagon's structural objectives, right? Like projecting power, justifying budgets.
Maintaining domestic support for alliances.
Yeah.
Because he knows all that, he can reverse engineer their public statements to find the underlying truth.
It makes sense. If you know the shape of the lens they're looking through, you can calculate the distortion.
Exactly. But then he contrasts this with the Iranian regime.
Right. He says the regime does not believe in being clear. It believes in deception and lies.
And then he drops this incredible chilling phrase.
Yeah, what is it?
He says, for the regime, not talking is the talk.
Not talking is the talk. That is wild.
What's fascinating here is that this is where we get into the deep game theory of information warfare.
Okay, lay that out for me.
Well, we typically assume the aggressor is the one flooding the zone with misinformation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shouting the loudest to drown out the truth.
Yeah, that's the standard playbook.
But the author is pointing out an entirely different, highly effective tactic. Deliberate opacity.
But let's test that logic, though. I mean, if you are a state actor under immense military pressure and you refuse to put out a narrative, aren't you just surrendering the microphone?
You are.
Aren't you letting your enemy and that drama-hungry media we just talked about completely define you to the world?
You are surrendering the narrative, sure, but you are gaining a massive tactical advantage in unpredictability.
Unpredictability.
Think of it like a high-stakes game of poker, where one player simply refuses to look at their own cards or cover their face or make a sound.
That would be terrifying to play against.
Exactly. If an adversary knows exactly what your parameters are, even if you are lying about your exact military capabilities, they can model your behavior.
They can build a containment strategy.
Right. But if you provide zero reliable information, if your state apparatus operates as an impenetrable black box built on total deception and silence, you force your adversary to constantly guess.
It induces profound paranoia.
Yes. In game theory, this is related to ambiguity aversion. When not talking is the talk, every silence is interpreted as a potential trap.
And it paralyzes the opposing leadership's decision-making process because they have to prepare for every conceivable outcome simultaneously.
Precisely.
And think about how that weaponized silence interacts with the media business model we just discussed.
So it's a perfect storm.
If the regime provides a black box, it forces the U.S. and Indian media to fill that informational void with their own manufactured drama, their own speculation.
Which only amplifies the global confusion.
It's a vicious, self-sustaining cycle.
The media becomes the unwitting amplifier of the regime's silence. And in a landscape where the media is desperately manufacturing these pendulum swings, and one of the primary combatants is utilizing weaponized ambiguity, the very concept of winning becomes entirely untethered from reality.
Yeah, how do you even measure a win in that environment?
You really can't. Which transitions us directly into how the author believes military metrics are fundamentally failing to measure this specific 2026 war.
Right. If the narrative is a manufactured pendulum, how do we even define victory?
It's the core question.
The author takes dead aim at what he calls the talking heads, the military pundits who evaluate war like it's a spreadsheet of destroyed assets.
Yeah, according to the source, these talking heads are out there arguing that hitting physical targets or decapitating leadership doesn't actually count as a win anymore.
The author introduces this concept of strategic victory, and it presents a massive, frustrating paradox for conventional military thinkers.
A huge paradox.
Yeah.
According to the framework he's critiquing, Iran is winning simply by virtue of the regime not collapsing.
Their victory condition isn't territorial conquest or military dominance.
No, is mere survival against a superior force.
But I have to push back heavily on the author's presentation of that logic.
Okay, what's your take?
I mean, if a regime survives, but its entire military infrastructure is vaporized, its economy is pushed back to the Stone Age, and its leadership is permanently hiding in bunkers,
Right.
how can anyone logically classify that as a win? It feels like we are moving the goalposts so far that the definition of warfare becomes meaningless. Isn't that just the avoidance of total formal surrender?
That frustration you were voicing is exactly the psychological trap of asymmetric warfare that the author is highlighting.
It's just so counterintuitive.
For a conventional superpower like the United States, a win historically looks like a treaty signed on the deck of a battleship or the total capitulation of the enemy capital.
Yeah, VJ Day, flags waving, the whole thing.
But for an entrenched regime facing overwhelming conventional force, simply existing the day after the bombing stops is framed internally and often globally as a victory.
Because the superpower applied its maximum will and the regime did not break.
Exactly. The survival is the defiance.
Wow. And the author paints an even darker picture for the United States, suggesting that even if they achieve their ultimate goal, they still lose.
He lays out this bleak lose-lose scenario.
Yeah, he says, if the regime does collapse and there's chaos, then the U.S. has lost.
His historical context here is absolutely vital for understanding his perspective. He explicitly invokes the ghosts of recent decades to explain the mechanics of this failure.
Right, he writes, there was Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria.
He reminds the reader that all wars are messy. There is always death and destruction.
He calls war a weapon of last resort, strictly because of this graveyard of past interventions.
He's looking at the 2026 landscape, and he's arguing that if the U.S. topples the regime but leaves a power vacuum, they haven't won anything.
I mean, mechanically, what happens in that vacuum? If the central authority is removed, but there's no localized democratic infrastructure ready to take over.
That void is immediately filled by sectarian militias, regional warlords, and proxy forces.
Exactly. The author is saying that triggering a multi-decade bloodbath cannot be wrapped up in a mission-accomplished banner.
No, that is a strategic, generational defeat masquerading as a tactical military victory.
This raises an incredibly important question about the geopolitical framing of the conflict itself. Who actually owns the stakes of this war?
Yeah, the author is adamant about decentering one specific, prominent player that usually dominates this regional conversation.
Yes, this jumped right off the page. He explicitly states the biggest mistake is to think this is Israel's war.
He writes, this is not Israel's war. Israel just happens to be at the forefront.
By insisting on this distinction, he is forcing the reader to radically widen their aperture.
If you frame this solely as an Israel-Iran regional skirmish, your analytical lens is restricted to local borders, localized missile defense systems, and the immediate funding of regional proxy groups.
Right, it's a contained narrative.
But by stating that Israel is merely at the forefront, he is reclassifying this as a global conflict.
He implies that the underlying tensions, the economic stakes, and the potential geopolitical fallout involve the entire international order.
The U.S., China, Russia, India, not just the immediate geography of the Middle East.
So if conventional military strikes just lead to either the regime surviving and claiming asymmetric victory, or the regime collapsing into a chaotic void where the U.S. effectively loses, what is the structural way out?
It seems like a dead end.
The author paints this incredibly bleak military matrix, but then he introduces what he literally calls the saving grace.
Yes. And this completely shifts the paradigm of his argument away from military logistics, missile counts, and state propaganda.
He places the ultimate resolution squarely on human agency.
He argues that the solution lies completely outside the military domain, It rests entirely with the Iranian people.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because he just listed Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria as the ultimate cautionary tales of power vacuums.
Right.
But then he draws a hard, definitive line. He says, Iran is different. Iran is not Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria.
He bases this structural distinction on the historical behavior and political mobilization of the Iranian populace.
He points to 2 decades of the people continually taking to the streets to protest the regime, right?
Yes, despite facing immense, lethal personal risk, he doesn't view them as passive victims waiting for external liberation.
He views them as an active, highly mobilized political body, fundamentally distinct from the civil structures in the other nations he listed.
And to prove this unprecedented level of mobilization, he drops this highly specific, almost tantalizing historical claim about the Iranian diaspora.
Yeah, he says they did something entirely unprecedented on February 14th.
The quote is quite absolute. What the diaspora did on February 14, no diaspora has done ever.
He doesn't just say it was a large gathering, he measures it against massive historical benchmarks.
He says it was bigger than the Russian diaspora in 1988.
Bigger than the Polish diaspora. But I have to stop and push back on the sheer scale of that claim.
Okay, why?
The text itself doesn't explicitly detail the mechanics of what happened on February 14th in 2026. But to claim it eclipses the Russian diaspora in 1988.
It's a bold claim.
The Russian diaspora, through capital flight, intense diplomatic pressure, and cultural isolation, fundamentally helped crack the foundation of the Soviet Union.
Right.
The Polish diaspora essentially bankrolled and politically insulated the solidarity movement that broke Soviet control in Poland.
Yeah, massive historical impact.
How could a modern diaspora possibly wield more structural power than those historical giants?
It's a massive claim. And to understand his logic, we have to look at the tools available to a diaspora in 2026 versus 1988.
Okay, that makes sense.
In 1988, diaspora power was largely limited to physical lobbying in host capitals, mailing underground literature, or funneling physical currency. It was slow and analog.
Very analog.
By 2026, a highly educated, globally integrated diaspora has access to decentralized financial networks, instantaneous global cyber mobilization, and the ability to systematically dismantle a regime's digital infrastructure from thousands of miles away.
Wow, okay.
While we don't know the specific event of February 14th, the author's comparison implies a synchronized, digital-first projection of power that bypassed traditional borders entirely.
He is viewing them not just as expats holding signs, but as a uniquely potent, distributed geopolitical force capable of crippling a state apparatus.
Precisely.
Okay, let's accept his premise that the diaspora is historically mobilized and that the people inside the country have a 2-decade track record of fierce resistance.
Okay.
That naturally leads to most obvious glaring question, which the author himself anticipates. If the people are this powerful and they are the ultimate saving grace, where are they right now?
Yeah, he writes, some people are already counting that out. Look, there's nobody in the streets.
The author brings us crashing back to the brutal, immediate reality of the 2026 conflict.
He completely rejects the cynical Western interpretation that empty streets indicate apathy or that the resistance has failed.
He attributes the empty streets entirely to the cold logic of extreme asymmetric violence.
He gets incredibly practical here, almost blunt. He says, if bombs were dropping all around you, you might also skip grocery shopping. Forget protesting.
It's a dark analogy, but it maps perfectly to human behavior. It's Maslow's hierarchy of survival.
Right.
You cannot engineer a complex political revolution if you are being vaporized on the way to the town square.
And it's vital to note that it's not just the external military bombing he mentions. He specifically details the internal, localized tactics of the regime's enforcement arms.
Right. He explicitly names the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the Bassi militia.
He describes their strategy as absolutely brutal, noting that they will literally rain machine gun fire into peaceful crowds.
So the streets are empty because stepping into them is a literal death sentence at this exact moment in the timeline. The people haven't given up, they are pinned down.
Which introduces the author's specific mechanical timeline for revolution. It revolves around a very clinical military concept, degradation.
He explicitly states, not enough degradation has happened.
He is arguing that the Iranian people are currently engaged in a calculated tactical retreat.
They are waiting for the external military forces, whether that's the U.S., Israel, or a coalition dropping the bombs to sufficiently degrade the physical and logistical suppression capabilities of the IRGC and the Bassi.
They need the external military to strip away the regime's muscle.
So the military strikes are essentially clearing the board, and then he outlines the final phase.
He says, once enough degradation has happened and the bombing has stopped, the people will come out into the streets again and engineer the regime collapse.
Notice the specific terminology he uses to describe this final phase. He calls the civilian population returning to the streets the ultimate asymmetric warfare.
I find that framing so compelling.
We are conditioned to think of asymmetric warfare purely in technological terms, like a small rebel group using a $500 commercial drone to disable a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier.
Yeah, the classic David and Goliath tech story.
But he's elevating that concept to human sociology. He's saying the ultimate asymmetry isn't a cheap weapon, it's a massive civilian population simply refusing to be governed anymore.
He says, missiles and drones are not going to work on them.
Think about the mechanics of that. A regime can use drones to target a military base or a specific convoy.
But you cannot drone strike your entire power grid, your own water supply, and your entire labor force.
You cannot bomb an entire society that has collectively, quietly decided that you are no longer the authority.
This leads to a moment of profound self-reflection in the text.
Yeah, the author spends this entire essay analyzing troop degradation, historical military failures, and regime collapse, but he suddenly pulls back the curtain and states his core philosophical foundation.
He writes, I don't start with military power. I start with moral clarity.
Which is such a striking, almost jarring thing to read on a blog dedicated to intense war analysis.
And he follows it up by actively mocking the very medium he is utilizing.
Yeah, he says, it is my firm belief that you cannot become a military expert by watching YouTube videos. I am no military expert.
The irony embedded in that statement is thick, and I suspect it's entirely intentional.
He dismisses the YouTube military experts, the talking heads we discussed earlier, who treat human conflict like an interactive video game score.
Yet his entire argument about information warfare is physically embedded within a digital ecosystem heavily reliant on YouTube.
If you scroll down his blog post past the text we just spent all this time analyzing, you hit this massive curated wall of YouTube video embeds.
We have to talk about this digital battlefield he's presented. Because the visual layout of this blog post is the argument.
The medium is the message here.
The author warned us in his very first paragraph that information warfare is adding to the confusion.
The specific videos he chose to embed serve as a raw, unfiltered visual feed of that exact confusion.
They represent the fractured, deeply contradictory narratives bombarding a global citizen in 2026.
Again, a quick reminder for our listeners as we analyze this section. We are examining the presence, the juxtaposition, and the framing of these specific video titles to understand the chaotic information ecosystem the author is demonstrating.
We are not verifying the factual claims or validating the politics within these videos.
Right, so let's methodically map these narratives out because the whiplash is intense.
Right next to each other, you have a deep existential fracture in U.S. domestic politics bleeding directly into the geopolitical war narrative.
First, we see a video from Tom Bilyeu's channel featuring a Prof. Jang with the title, "Trump can't end this war. If he loses power, he goes to prison."
This frames the entire Middle Eastern conflict through the hyper-specific lens of immense, precarious domestic political pressure in the United States.
It suggests the war is entirely captive to one man's legal jeopardy.
But then, just a few pixels down the screen, you have a live feed from Live Now from FOX.
And the title is, "We Won't. Trump speaks on Iran, Strait of Hormuz, NATO executions Israel."
Consider the cognitive mechanics of reading those two titles sequentially.
It's crazy.
In one breath, the viewer is told the American leader is trapped, powerless to end the war, and facing domestic imprisonment if the conflict continues.
In the very next breath, they are watching that exact same leader declare absolute sweeping victory across multiple global theaters on live television.
The cognitive dissonance is immediate and destabilizing.
And it gets so much broader than just American politics. The author embeds a video from a channel called One for Israel Ministry titled "The Spiritual Battle Behind the War in the Middle East."
This injects an entirely different paradigm, a theological framework.
It takes a geopolitical conflict rooted in oil transit routes, nuclear enrichment timelines, and state suppression, and elevates it to a cosmic, divine struggle.
It removes human agency entirely and replaces it with prophecy.
But wait, if you're a viewer looking for pragmatic, earth-bound geopolitics, he immediately pivots.
He embeds a clip from ABC News Australia, featuring Shashi Tharoor, a prominent, highly respected Indian politician and diplomat.
Stating flatly that India won't burn bridges with Iran.
which perfectly illustrates the cold, calculated reality of international trade and multipolar diplomacy.
It contrasts sharply with the spherical battle narrative directly above it.
India requires energy security. They share strategic regional interests. They are playing a multi-decade-long game that operates completely independently of whatever immediate moral clarity or military victory the U.S. or Israel might be seeking.
And just to ensure that the Western mainstream narrative isn't the only one represented in this chaos, he includes a video from the Electronic Intifada featuring Satara Sadeghi.
Titled, "What They're Not Telling You About Iran."
This represents the explicit counter-narrative. It pushes back against the Pentagon propaganda the author referenced earlier,
Signaling to the viewer that the foundational premises of the conflict as presented to the Western public are either deeply flawed, intentionally hidden, or entirely fabricated.
And finally, rounding out this mosaic, a video from a channel called Vantage Ledger claiming the U.S. military is out of missiles and Iran knows it.
A sudden, jarring dive into the pure, unromantic logistics of the military-industrial base.
Stripping away the spirituality, the politics, and the diplomacy to focus entirely on supply chain exhaustion.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the psychological mechanism at play here.
This specific curation of links isn't random.
No, it perfectly proves the author's opening thesis about weaponized confusion.
Imagine you are a citizen in 2026, doom scrolling on a Saturday, just trying to understand if the global order is collapsing.
You go online, and within a single page view, you are simultaneously told the U.S. president has already won the war.
The U.S. president is going to prison because he can't end the war.
This is a literal biblical war of angels and demons.
India is ignoring the moral implications to maintain trade.
The mainstream media is actively lying to you about the causes.
And the U.S. military has physically run out of ammunition.
The medium is the confusion. This is what we call context collapse.
Context collapse. You cannot find the clear, objective X-ray showing the broken bone in this environment.
The author is proving that relying on an algorithmic digital feed for a coherent chronological understanding of a global war is biologically impossible for the human brain.
The sheer volume, speed, and extreme contradiction of these data points cancel each other out.
They don't synthesize into knowledge, they degrade into pure anxiety.
So who exactly is the mind curating all this chaos?
Yeah, who is this individual predicting regime change, claiming to be Barack Obama's first NYC volunteer, and seemingly absorbing every contradictory corner of the internet simultaneously?
To understand the deep context of this post, we have to look past the text and examine the margins of the blog. We have to look at the author himself, Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
This is where the source material expands from a single insightful op-ed into a portrait of a highly complex, perhaps eccentric, polymath.
If you look at the sidebar of this blog, the digital archive stretches back, completely unbroken, to October 2004.
He has amassed over 4.7 million page views over 2 decades of daily writing.
It is a staggering amount of sustained output, and his bibliography, it is wild.
It spans completely disparate fields of human knowledge. He's not just a geopolitical blogger writing about the Middle East.
Let's look at the actual titles of his longer works.
His intellectual obsessions seem to intersect across 3 major distinct pillars.
First, there is a massive, highly technical focus on artificial intelligence and the future of human computing.
We see titles like Liquid Computing, The Future of Human-Tech Symbiosis, The Country of Geniuses, A Race Through AI Adolescence, and a deeply specific time-stamped prediction.
Agentic AI, set to explode in 2026.
When I see the term agentic AI, I'm not thinking of the early generative AI that just writes a poem when you ask it to.
Right.
I'm thinking of systems that possess agency AI,
Yeah.
that is given a broad goal and actively, autonomously executes it.
Is he tying the explosion of that specific technology to the timeline of this war?
Precisely. Generative AI waits for a prompt. Agentic AI acts on its environment.
So an agentic AI in 2026 could be given the prompt, convince this specific demographic that the war is unwinnable, and the AI would autonomously research the demographic, generate the articles, create the deepfake videos, build the bot networks to distribute them, and continually A/B test the emotional manipulation until the goal is achieved.
The author is looking at 2026 not just as the year of a kinetic war in Iran, but as the exact historical tipping point where autonomous AI fundamentally alters how human beings process reality.
That is terrifying. Then you have this entirely different pillar in his bibliography focused on macroeconomics and spirituality.
He has multiple books on a concept he calls calcism.
We see titles like Calciism, the economic and spiritual blueprint for an age of abundance, and a very geographically specific work, The 20% Growth Revolution, Nepal's Path to Prosperity through Calciism.
To understand the synthesis here, we have to define the term. Kalki traditionally refers to the 10th and final incarnation of the god Vishnu in Hindu eschatology.
Prophesied to appear at the end of the current epoch, the Kali Yuga, a period of darkness and moral decline to rid the world of corruption and usher in a new enlightened golden age.
By blending this deep theological prophecy with an economic blueprint for abundance, and specifically applying it to a nation like Nepal to achieve a staggering 20% growth revolution, he is fusing ancient spiritual epochs with highly aggressive modern macroeconomic theory.
And the third pillar of his writing is pure geopolitical fiction and analysis. We see titles like Trump's Default, The Mist of Empire, 6 Weeks from Zero, and The Banyan Revolt.
So what does this all mean?
When we take his localized essay on the Iran war and place it inside this massive, decades-long matrix of agentic AI predictions, spiritual economics, and geopolitical sci-fi, how does it change our reading of the source material?
I think it reveals that Paramendra is an extreme systems thinker.
He does not view the Iran war as an isolated military event taking place in a vacuum.
To him, it is just one volatile variable in a massive, interconnected global equation.
The broader perspective is key. A traditional military analyst looks at the blast radius of a missile and calculates the localized damage.
This author is looking at how a regime's collapse in the Middle East intersects with the explosion of autonomous AI in Silicon Valley,
which in turn impacts the shifting trade dynamics of the Indian subcontinent, all while viewing these events through the lens of a spiritual transition into an age of abundance.
His focus on the Iranian diaspora as a world historic force capable of unprecedented action, and his total dismissal of tactical military strikes in favor of long-term structural degradation, is entirely consistent with someone who studies deep, epical shifts rather than daily troop movements.
He's playing a much, much longer analytical game.
Which brings us back to you, the listener, trying to navigate this exact moment in history.
In a world where the primary media feed is financially structured to feed you continuous daily drama.
And your digital landscape is a chaotic, algorithmic mix of spiritual warnings, political grandstanding, and logistical panic.
How do you find the moral clarity the author advocates for?
The author's approach is to radically zoom out. You have to look past the immediate noise of the drones, the conflicting YouTube titles, and the military talking heads.
You have to look at the slow structural realities, the historical multi-decade behavior of the people on the street, and the inevitable entropic outcomes of tyranny.
He finds his anchor in the human element, waiting for the degradation of the machines of violence.
But analyzing his worldview raises a final, really provocative thought for you to chew on today.
The author explicitly stated earlier that when it comes to the Iranian regime's deception, not talking is the talk.
Silence, ambiguity, and the refusal to engage is their most powerful weapon.
Yes, the strategic deployment of the void.
But let's extrapolate that concept into the technological world the author himself is predicting for 2026.
We are entering the era of agentic AI, where millions of articles, hyper-realistic videos, and algorithmic hot takes can be generated and distributed autonomously every single hour.
To tell us exactly who is winning, who is losing, and what we should fear, the volume of noise is going to scale beyond human comprehension.
It will be an absolute deluge of manufactured reality.
So if authoritarian regimes use silence to create paralyzing confusion, but the media and autonomous algorithms use infinite, deafening noise to create addictive drama.
In the 21st century is the ultimate weapon of the individual citizen, the choice to simply stop listening.
If the entire global information system requires your constant engagement, your anxiety, and your attention to validate its drama, maybe the ultimate act of asymmetrical information warfare is to turn off the feed, embrace the silence, and simply wait for the dust to settle.
It's a profound question of individual agency. Is our attention the very fuel that keeps the global confusion burning?
Something to seriously think about the next time you feel that biochemical urge to check your phone for the latest breaking alert.
Thank you for joining us as we unpack this incredible piece of the internet.
Keep questioning the feed, look for the structural realities beneath the noise, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.